Welcome to the 15th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at Front Lawn. The festival brochure and flyer with the details of the full program are available for purchase at the information desk. We are delighted to introduce Both and. Hillary Clinton's famously private top aide and longtime advisor, Huma Abedin's memoir, Both and, is a candid and inspiring retelling of her private and political life, throwing light on her experiences growing up in the United States of America and Saudi Arabia, her personal life and her connection with Clinton. Abedin's writing is a testament to the modern working woman. In conversation with Sudha Sadhanand, Abedin gives us a glimpse into her lived experiences and the many worlds she straddles. Huma Abedin has spent her entire career in public service and national politics, beginning as an intern in the First Lady Hillary Clinton's office in 1996. After 4 years in the White House, she worked in the US Senate as senior advisor to Senator Clinton, as traveling chief of staff for Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign, and deputy chief of staff at the US Department of State in 2009. Huma served as a vice chair of Hillary for America in 2016, resulting in the first woman elected nominee for a major political party. She currently serves as Hillary Clinton's chief of staff and is the New York Times best-selling author of Both and, A Life in Many Worlds. Sudha Sadhanand has spent more than 3 decades in various fields of mainstream media and allied streams such as publishing, radio, documentaries, and TV news. Sadhanand is one of the first bilingual anchors to have worked with some of the earliest private news channels. She began her career in publishing with Penguin Books and edited works of authors such as Pupul Jayakar and Professor Bipan Chandra. Her last stint with Westland Amazon, where she led their non-fiction list and edited Pawan K. Varma and Veer Sanghvi, amongst others. Currently, Sadhanand is President, Editorial Affairs at India Ahead. Over to you two.
Namaskar. Hello, how are you? Great to be in a session with Huma. I really loved your book. And like we were chatting, Huma, amongst other things, when I read her book, and I'm not going to plug this book, but all of us need to buy this book. And what's amazing is that spending so many years in public life, but still it's the woman who stands up each time. And so many of my friends stand up through Huma, in this book. So I'm going to start by throwing the mic at you and talking about what has this book done for you, Huma? I mean, I know that, it's got great reviews, fantastic, recommendations all over, and maybe you've already signed your second book. But the point is that as a woman and as someone who worked very closely with Hillary Clinton, what is this book all about for you today when you look back?
So first of all, thank you, Sudha. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you. And I have to make a confession to everybody in the audience that this is a bit of an emotional experience for me because I'm returning to this country as an American private citizen, having written my book. And for those of you who know anything about my life, which I assume you don't, but one of the reasons it's emotional is my father was born a few hours away in New Delhi, and my mom was born in Hyderabad. And India has always had a very special and close place in my heart. I am the classic American immigrant story. My dad was a professor, as was my mother. They were both Fulbright scholars. They met in the 60s, the University of Pennsylvania, fell in love, got married, and chose to make a life in the United States. And I was born in Michigan. And when I was 2, my father was told by his doctor that he had progressive renal failure. And he had 5 to 10 years and to sort out his affairs. And one of the first lines I wrote in this book was that my father was told he was dying, and so he went out and he lived. And 2 months later, we moved to Saudi Arabia, and that's where I spent my entire life. My parents took us all over the world. It's one of the reasons I brought my 10-year-old son here as well, is that back then, in the 80s, we went everywhere. And I think it's in part because my parents had a curiosity about the world. They always told us a couple of things. My father always said that our eyes are at the front of our head for a reason. It's to look forward, but that it was important to understand history and to learn from the mistakes of that history. And so when I walked into the White House in 1996 to work for then President Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton, it was all of the life experiences and the way I was raised that informed my experience as an advisor to American politicians, and I fell in love with public service. I've had 25 years in politics, many, many highs. I have witnessed history more times than I can count. Somebody asked me the other day, is there a famous person alive who you have not met and want to meet? And I had to struggle because I cannot think of a person. I can't count the number of times I have stayed at palaces or been on Air Force One. And when I think about this life of extraordinary privilege, in America, most people know my story and that I'm the silent staff person. I never speak. I'm invisible. I'm always in service of others. And finally, after 25 years, I've told my story. And when people say, how could you go through such hardship? I had to deal with a very public betrayal in my marriage, not once, but 3 times. There are people in America who suggest that I am the reason Hillary Clinton lost the election, and I had to live with that guilt and trauma for many years. And when people say to me, how do you get up every day? How are you so resilient? How are you out in the world? How are you in Jaipur talking about your book? One of the reasons I wrote a book, and here I am at a literature festival that I have admired from afar for many years, is that it was great therapy. And I also think that it is, in some ways, when people say, I don't understand, I don't get it, how can you be this person? I say, you have to understand where I came from. And that's why the entire first part of my book, I really begin with my nani, who as 8 years old in 1912, living in Hyderabad, demanded to be educated in a school, which was something that was not done back then. It was considered improper. And so she cut a deal with her parents that she would leave from the back of the house with 2 sheets covering on either side as she got on an ox cart and went to school every day. And I think of every privilege I've had, and I really owe it to her. So the book in part is to honor her, to honor my parents. And my mother is just as much a heroine as my father. And my parents always said to me, we don't care what you do. You can do anything in your life that you want. All we require is that you be educated. And so I went to school, I studied hard, and I was able to succeed. And the very last thing I'll say is people say, well, you're supposed to be in public service or in politics. Aren't you going to run for office? And I write about, I share the story about when I was a little girl, my father, whenever he went anywhere, and he would go to many literature festivals, he would bring back a book or many books. And when I was 10, he brought back a book called Silas Marner. And I remember at the time, it was above my head. I didn't understand it. And I read the introduction and I go to my father and I said, I don't understand, Abu, why did Marianne Evans have to use a man's name, George Eliot, to write her book? And my father said, well, back in the Victorian era, women were not taken seriously as writers. And so she used a man's name. But don't worry, when you grow up and you write your own book, you will use your own name and everyone will take it seriously. So this book came out in November in the United States and in India. And the response has been just overwhelming and gratifying. And in part, it's an honor to be here in my homeland to talk about it.
Wonderful. And that's why I said that when I was reading this book, it reminded me of my father. It reminded me of several of my friends, who would always say what Huma beautifully said just now, the proverbial child of the subcontinent that you are, Huma. I mean, let me start with, like I said, that, if you read the book, at least the first part is more about the woman that she is, the child that she was. And then, of course, public service is also a very, very important part. But she's because of who her parents were and the atmosphere was in her home. So, her father says in the book, I don't need a country to tell me I am Muslim. Your father says that when he chose not to migrate to Pakistan, also his journey to the US, where all his mates, would be praying. They were from different faiths. That part I really like because it's almost like watching a film at that time. But do you think the world is as uncomplicated as it was, when your father said that? Because let me finish, your mother's family they were called out, in the aftermath of the Mahatma's assassination when they had to move to Karachi. So there is a conundrum there itself. Would you like to talk a bit about that?
Well, I think the world is complicated now, and it was complicated then. My father's family, they originally came from Central Asia and ended up in North India. And my father was a great patriot. He loved his country. He loved this country. And when the time came for partition, I think some people in this audience might appreciate it. His father was a civil servant. He was a medical doctor, my dada. And my father was one of 6 boys. So there were 6 girls and 6 boys in the family. And he was the only surviving son. None of his brothers lived past the age of 10. And so he felt a great responsibility as being the only son in his family. And so when the time for partition came, they were a Muslim family. The decision was, should we move to Pakistan, was left to the 19-year-old, heir. And my father refused to leave. He loved his country. He believed that it was possible to live in harmony so long as we were willing to respect and accept other people's beliefs and values. And that is how he lived his entire life. And it's one of the reasons he refused to leave. He had actually always intended on coming back home. He was promised to one of his cousins. He was meant to marry one of his cousins before he left for his master's. And then he met my mother. And they had such an American, version of a desi wedding in that he met her on campus and then sent his family from Delhi to her to take the formal proposal. So when my mother got the call from the operator in Pennsylvania and the line was bad, my mother says, "I don't understand." And the operator says, "They're saying congratulations, you're engaged." And my mother says, "What?" And this American operator says, "Ma'am, you don't know that you're engaged?" So it was one of those, wonderful stories, but he really did. And then he spent his entire life actually having, he didn't believe that you shouldn't have conversations with the other. And it's one of the reasons why. So I'm a Democrat. That's the political party I belong to, the United States. And people always say to me, and I was very close with Senator John McCain. Some of you may have known a very, dynamic Republican, but who was also not afraid to buck his party when he did not agree with some of the things that they stood for. And that's the party that I was part of, which is, at a time in our country. And I think back in the 90s and 2000s, you could have these difficult conversations. You cannot now. It's a much more divided political country. So in some ways, I think things have changed. So then in some ways, they have not changed. Yes.
Yeah. So now, like I'll keep saying this, that Huma, the woman that you are and the kind of work you did, they synchronize so beautifully. And sometimes the woman stands out and sometimes the person who's working, for Hillary Clinton stands out. Now, I'm sure that a lot of the audience, and also since I came to know that I was going to be in a conversation with you, wanted me to ask you this, and it's there in the book on page 107 precisely, where you say, President Clinton accepts the misdemeanor. You say that in that book. But so far as Hillary is concerned, when you explain this, when she's handling the entire thing, she did this for the country. She did this for the family. Now, again, considering that the woman that you are, how did you cope with something like this? Because it's kind of still, like you say, things have changed, but they remain so much the same. It's kind of scandalous for any of us to accept it. You were working for her. You were working in her office. How was it to be those days walking those shoes?
So as I mentioned, I spent my formative years. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. It was a very, conservative society. I actually didn't know anybody in my surrounding classmates growing up who were the product of divorce. It was not part of my my world. And so to walk in And people in America are always surprised when I remind them. And Sudha's asking me about the impeachment when President Clinton was impeached in the second term of the White House. I was 21. No, I was 20 maybe. I was an intern. I was studying journalism at George Washington University because I had decided I wanted to be Christiane Amanpour, who back in the early 2000s was this really dynamic, she still is, phenomenal, amazing journalist. And I'd seen her on TV in the middle of the first Gulf War in 1990, and I thought, I want to be that, went to Washington. And then by accident, ended up with this internship at the White House, working for the then First Lady. And so to me, and people always ask, and I was telling Sudha earlier, now that the book has been out a couple of months in America, the one place I spend much of my time, frankly, physically, is at universities and colleges in America. And I always get asked the same questions by students. They always say the same thing. How did you know? How did you know you were going to be so successful? How did you know you were going to get to do all these amazing things? And I always say the same thing to them, which is I had no idea. All I knew, I was never the best, the prettiest, the smartest. I was never the ist at anything. But what I was prepared to do was outwork everybody. And I walked into the White House, fell in love with the work. Back then, it was a first lady. She'd given her Beijing conference speech, the famous speech about women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights a year before. And it was just an exciting place to be. I try to take the reader through that, what it's like to walk down that red carpet and up the marble staircases, what it is to get up every day and walk into the White House. And for somebody like me who didn't, I'd never dated, I'd never had, my heart broken. I didn't understand what she was going through when the Monica Lewinsky story had broken. I didn't believe it was true. As I'm sure those of you who are old enough to remember, President Clinton denied it. And I 100%, believed that was true. And so immediately, I became very protective of her. I wanted to she had so much stress on her shoulders out in the world, press following her everywhere. So I just wanted to do my job well. And I tell these stories in the book about, I also had no idea what I was doing. I was learning on the job. So I share a story about how she goes on stage for a big speech. It's my first trip with her. And she stands up on stage, she's at the podium, and then she calls me over. I'm at the back of the room, and I go up to the podium, and she says, I don't have my speech. And she's about to give her speech, and I go run to the car and find that, while I was carrying one version of the speech, she had another, version of the speech. And it was, part of it was the environment that she created. There's a whole chapter in the book called Hillary Land. And I think in a world where women don't often support other women professionally and often personally, that is a culture she created. I talk about Hillary Land being a place where it's all about, how can we do this better? How can I help you get that promotion? You're a really good speechwriter. How is your mother doing? Congratulations on your wedding. And Hillary Land is all of those things because Hillary Clinton is all of those things. And as women in Hillary Land climb up that ladder of, excellence and success, instead of stepping on the fingers of those of us below, our goal in Hillary Land is you reach to the lowest rung and you pull the women behind you along. And I it is one of the reasons I believe that she is such an extraordinary leader. I do think that she really showed tremendous, both sort of strength of will. She had to, as she has very publicly said, she wasn't sure she was going to stay in the marriage and decided after much reflection it was the right thing for her family and her country. And I share exactly why. It was a very difficult time in our lives, those of us who were in the Clinton White House, but it was really an honor for me to be there to help her through it.
And talking about misdemeanors, page 161, a senator makes an advance at you. That's one of the best chapters because when you're reading the book, you don't think it's going to come up. It suddenly pops up and then it suddenly goes away. It's like not much ado is made about it. So how did you deal with that? Because the person that you were, Huma, for me, you were shocked, of course, but then it also seems like you buried it under the work that you had to do, that, okay, what is next? Something about plan which fails to plan, which she kept saying all the time. So you just get up, someone makes an advance at you, and then you decide that you'll proceed doing what next had to be done. Talk a bit about that.
Well, I did share that story for two reasons. So when I first sat down to start writing this book, the young woman who is the researcher doing all the fact checking for the book said, I've been looking at all the news articles about you from the last 10 years. And the most common headlines are what is wrong with her and what is she thinking? And it is one of the reasons I chose to put exactly what I was thinking. And I also intentionally chose to put the full truth in the book. It's been many years whenever, I'll read an article. First of all, I don't read anything about myself, but my staff will come up to me and say, or my colleagues will say, I heard you did X, Y, or Z. And if it's not true, I just ignored it. But I shared that story because I try to think of all of the positive things, for those of us who supported Hillary Clinton, all the positive things that came out of her loss in 2016. And one of them was this movement for people, and particularly women and people of color in my country, to come forward and say enough is enough, and standing up and speaking their own truth, which they have obviously every right to do. And for me, that moment, women in America are often accused of convenient memory. And I remember when the hearings for then Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh were undergoing, and there was a woman who had accused him of bad behavior many years before. And she was being accused of essentially making this, why did all of a sudden this get triggered? And as I'm watching her be accused on TV, this memory of a very uncomfortable situation I had with a senator when I was a young 20-something-year-old working in Washington came into my head. And to your point, I do think a lot of women bury unpleasant experiences. We just want everything to go back to normal. And certainly back then, that's the way things were. This was a powerful senator. I had to work with him, and I had to figure out how to navigate that. It wasn't easy. But it is one of the reasons I chose to write it. And it felt good about sharing my truth. I wanted to put it in context. I didn't have an experience that, many, many people, both men and women, have had horrific trauma and experiences. And I wanted to be respectful of those experiences, but I did want to share that story because it's the truth. And I didn't want to be accused of not including it and then, being confronted about it later. And I felt good. I felt good about just putting, it's all in that book now.
And talking about which, where you say that some of the women do bury and eclipse it out of their memory. So did the routine of marriage also help Hillary? Because we read in the book that after the whole Monica Lewinsky episode, she's just being so like a wife and talks about Windex. I mean, I think domesticity somewhere, the routine of it. Did she try to do it, or it seems a bit contrived, but then I'll ask you because perhaps that was the truth and that was how the marriage was with all the what's and, even good moments.
So I've had the privilege of seeing the Clintons behind the scenes for 26 years now this September. And yes, they had to undergo a very public counting of President Clinton's personal failings, but it to me never took away from this idea that she really loved her husband and her husband really loved her. And they decided, it should have been private. It couldn't have been, given obviously the fact that he was president. But any normal marriage where there is a betrayal is often, you're often able to sort it privately. And so I only know what I've seen, which is a genuine a meeting of the minds. They're both these brilliant problem solvers. They both seem happiest when they're in each other's company. And so I choose to believe that truth, the truth that I see of the two of them. And they've been married longer than I've been alive. And so I think they made that choice, and, I respect them for it.
Right. The first meeting with Obama, where Hillary says, perhaps to her husband, Bill, and says that I think that's the first African-American president that I have just met. You interacted with him, a lot that evening, when you're all meeting and even subsequently. Would you like to share what was it that really stood out about him, if, that evening when you met him and later when he became president, of course?
I think there's this thing people say that when you're in politics, or actually if you're just in public life, some people just have it. Some people have that magic sauce, that charisma, that moment when you walk into the room, that presence that overtakes you. I would argue that Bill Clinton has it, and certainly, and frankly, I think George W. Bush had it as well. I didn't understand why George W. Bush. He was from the opposite party, and then I met him. He walked into the room, and I thought, okay, now I get it. And so the short answer is, President Obama just exuded this feel, it's electricity almost. There was something so exciting about him. He was, charismatic, and he was brilliant. And when you were in a room with him, or when you listened to him speak, it made you feel like anything was possible. And at a time when, just to, take the audience back, we were, at least in America, in the midst of a many-year war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were not going well, to have this sense of hope and optimism and excitement in this dynamic young candidate. Now, it's very funny because he now says, when he does interviews, he says, oh, now everyone says they, knew I was going to be president. But it is true, the first time Hillary was asked to do an event for him, and we'd never heard of him. In fact, I remember somebody called me and said, somebody from his team called and said, would you do a fundraiser for this man named Barack Obama? I wrote in my book, B-A-R-A-K. I didn't even know how to spell his name. And we went to Chicago, and Hillary met him and did an event with him. And we got in the car, and she called President Clinton, and she said, I just met. And this was 2004, 2003. She said, I just met our first African-American president, and you have to come and help. We have to all help him succeed. And in the end, she did. She lost to him a few years later in 2008, but an extraordinary candidate. And really a privilege to work for him in his White House as well, which I was fortunate enough to do.
Yeah, talking about which she begins campaigning for Obama, that whole chapter and the kind of madness that one had to go through. And, the eye for detail is fantastic, let me tell you. But, when several people are still telling her that, Hillary, you have it in you, you can win, people want you to be back, she just turns back and she says, I am never doing this again. So talk a bit about that. What made her?
Well, in 2007, when Hillary was running for president for the 2008 election, we had a very dynamic primary contest on the Democratic side. There were many candidates running, by the way, including Joe Biden, who is our current president. So it really came down to Hillary and then Senator Obama. And we knew when she entered the contest that it was going to be very hard for a woman. We had research that showed that both men and women have a hard time seeing women in executive leadership positions. So it's much easier for women to run for Congress in our country than to run for mayor or governor or certainly president, because it's not even conscious. We have a hard time seeing women in positions of leadership. So we knew that, and all throughout 2008, and I write about this in detail, the specific examples of how hard it was, both in 2008 and 2016, to please everybody. People always said things like, everyone had a different opinion. She would do an event, and afterwards, a man would say to me, she should not wear color. She should only wear, black suits. And somebody else would say, she always looks angry. She looks like she's yelling when she's speaking. So when she goes up on the podium, you should put a picture of her grandchild on the podium so that when she looks down at it, she'll see something that makes her happy, and then she'll be happy. It was but because we had no precedent for what an American female leader looks like, she could never quite get it right. So the sexism was really hard. Obviously, we had lots of challenges both in 2008 and 2016. And so, yes, she said she was never going to do it again. She did. After 2008, she ran in 2016 and ran a very, vibrant campaign. And that did not turn out, even though 3 million more people voted for her, the electoral system in our country meant that Donald Trump won.
And talking about sexism, the man who held up a placard saying, iron my shirt, is that right?
Yes. 2 days before the election, there were men holding up signs in the back of the room when she was speaking, saying, iron my shirt, yelling, iron my shirt. So yes, it still happens.
It's so tough. Tell me something, as a woman who was raised as a Muslim and, like I say, you're the child of the subcontinent, you grew up in Saudi Arabia. How do you contend with the fact that, America was blamed? You talk about that in your book for most of the problems in the Muslim world. Would you like to talk a bit about that,
I do talk a lot about it, and in part because, I have a chapter in my book called Moving Along the Seams. And in part, because I was raised in both worlds. That's why the book is called Both And. I was raised in both worlds. So I share the stories of in the middle of the Kosovar War, going to refugee camps in Macedonia and feeling a connection to the women and children there, going to Iraq when the war was just, really in a very challenging place in 2005, and making, back then George Bush was making the decision about whether there should be a troop surge or not, and sitting at a table with these women, and literally a woman putting her hand on mine, even though I'm on the American delegation with the rest of the American delegation, including Hillary, saying, I never imagined I would live my life being afraid to get in the car and drive home at night. You know what I mean? Feeling that connection, that I would understand her life, and constantly hearing, when will this end? And I think it's a challenge in the United States. When I started working in the White House back in the 1990s, we were the sole superpower in the world. A lot has changed since then. And in part, on the one hand, look what is happening in Ukraine right now. My heart breaks every time I can't sleep at night, waking up and seeing the humanitarian crisis that is, we're in the midst of witnessing before our very eyes. On the one hand, people want the United States to be a leader on the world stage. And then on the other hand, it's don't tell us how to, be sovereign nations. It is a delicate balance. And I think every administration has had to try to do it a different way. Every time I've been in the subcontinent, I have represented the United States, both in India, Pakistan, all throughout the subcontinent. And it's tricky. It's complicated. It's, on the one hand, we're one of the largest sources of funding in the world to many other countries in the world. And on the others, there's this sense of, don't tell us how to do it. How do you find that balance? It's complicated.
It was, did you face that conundrum all through? Because were there moments when you felt that, yes, America was funding a lot of countries, but also being blamed for all the mayhem in the Muslim world?
Oh, absolutely. I think not. Well, look, back then, I walked in and we were right at the brink of making peace between, we being the Clinton administration, was about to make peace with the Palestinian-Israeli and peace process. It is one of the things that I, growing up in Saudi Arabia, felt so attached to, because all I knew from the moment I could watch TV in the 80s, every single day, it was about the war, the ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And in June of 2000, during the Camp David Accords, they were so close to a deal. And actually, President Clinton has shared the story that in January, after George Bush was sworn in, 6 months later, Yasser Arafat, who had not signed the deal, calls him up and says, I'm ready to take that deal. So it was this moment of hope. And then obviously, it did not turn out that way. I was not supportive of the war in Iraq, but I was a kid. I just knew what I knew, which is Saddam Hussein doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, but I wasn't reading any of the intelligence at the time. And look what happened. And then from the American perspective, I worked for the United States Senator from New York on 9/11. And I think those of us who are New Yorkers, that moment of terrorism was so shocking. So, I think we're still figuring out how it's affected us psychologically and emotionally. It's complicated.
It is complicated, yes. And I appreciate you feel that. I would like you to focus on Hillary Land. I like that term, that name that you gave. It's really nice if you read the book. And this is context. It's not something which is like schoolgirls that, you're my best friend today and you'll have my back. But it's all about women who are leaders. And when they have on their staff a lot of women, young, middle-aged, old, single, gay, working for them, it's really tough. And I just want you to focus on, because it's presumed that she's a woman and therefore We were talking about it, when we were having tea back then, that it hasn't changed. It has changed a lot, but a lot needs to change. So talk a bit about, how was it in Hillary Land? Because I read how you women actually, supported each other each time, and through very difficult times, that too.
I always say that that whenever I've had a problem in my life, I mean, people ask me this all the time. Like, do you and Hillary, still chat? And I talked to her a couple of hours ago. She's jealous. She's not here, by the way. But she'll have to write a book that, and then she can come. But that she's always approached it as a friend first and as a boss second. And I think she is somebody who knows that if you feel supported in your personal life, you will show up to work and do your best. And that has been the culture in our office. I think it's one of the reasons why she is such a model for leadership. I'm obviously biased, but I've seen it. I think she's one of those people who, if you're sitting at a table, and I have spent a lot of time with a lot of very successful men and women, and she has two things that I think you need to be a good leader. She has radical empathy. She's always able to put herself in somebody else's shoes, always. And secondly, she does not have an insecurity about who she is and what she knows. She really doesn't. So a lot of people, they don't want smarter people than them at the table. If I'm the CEO, I don't want that guy who knows this better than me to be or that woman to be at the table. She's exactly the opposite. She is in the who knows this better than I know it on everything from the economy, infrastructure, climate, you name it, healthcare. I want all the smartest people in the room, and I want this them at the table. And there's always more seats at the table. And I think that is why whatever job she's done, she does really well. She does successfully. Her challenge has always been in electoral politics, right? It's winning, even though she's been very successful. When she's actually been governing, when she's actually had the job, I mean, her ratings have basically been 10 for 10. I mean, just tremendous. And I think it is in part that she has that ability to connect and create a supportive work environment. My 10-year-old is backstage. When he was first born and I was trying to figure out, how do I do this? What do I do? She said, just bring him to work. So I brought him to work. And in fact, I there were days, the very first day I brought Jordan to work and I was still nursing. I had stayed at a hotel the night before and I had pumped milk so I could feed him with a bottle in these meetings. And we're at the State Department with, in these very official meetings, and the hotel threw out the bottles of milk. So here I am spending, I think the mothers in the room will relate to this. And so here I am at this big official meeting and turn to my boss and say, I need to present, but I also need to feed my child. She's like, go ahead. I mean, it is making your life easier, making it normal, things that are, not necessarily. And that's what she does. It's just figure out what the problem is. Let's find a solution. And it is one of the reasons that she's been, so successful. And I end the book. She is one of the reasons. I have people in America who come up to me and say, I wish I had read this book before she ran for president. This Hillary is just an extraordinary human being. And she is.
And talking about which, when you first, you receive a call. I mean, I'm going back now. It's part one of the book. You receive a call, you are at a family wedding or function, and then you rush, you're not thinking, you're just rushing. The point is that how long did it take because you were also terrified. And in the book, I could see sometimes you were nervous, not terrified, nervous about doing things right. And there are times when Hillary says it's absolutely okay, and I'm sorry, things will go right. I mean, it's not going to get bad from here. How long did it take for you to kind of gain that confidence in both you as women, as somebody who's working as a team?
My father always said that a good life is a balanced life, but I did not follow that advice at all. And the story you're referring to is when I was at a family wedding in 1997. And I was in the middle of a wedding and I got a call. I had just started working at the White House. I was a very young, brand new staff person. And I got a call from the White House saying the first lady is going to Argentina. Somebody dropped out. Do you want to travel? You'd have to leave immediately, basically. And I have this moment of making the decision that right in front of me is one option, a marriage and my family, a good life. And the other is leave and take the call and get on the plane. And I will tell you, I always took the call. I did not stay with my family, like ever. I have missed all my nephews and nieces' births, their weddings. I missed my son's first words. I missed his first steps. I was not there because I always took the call. I was always working. And it is one of the reasons I excelled. It's one of the reasons I did so well, but I did not have that balance. And it really shook me When she lost in 2016, Hillary was the one who basically said, go, focus on your family. And one of the things I've tried to do over the last few years is self-care, taking care of myself. I am like a lot of people. I'm not sure this is a female thing. A lot of people have a fear of public speaking or this imposter syndrome. I had that. I didn't think I'd be very good. I didn't think I'm shocked there are this many people here. I didn't think anyone would be interested in ever hearing my story or listening to me, which is why the last few months I've been kind of walking around on this crazy, like I think I'm in a dream. But I have found balance. I now try to find friends. I mean, I have two friends in the front row, dear friend Shavina and her daughter Devisha. I texted them 3 days ago and said, I'm coming with Jordan. And she's like, let's have lunch tomorrow. I would have never done that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Just having these relationships that, are valuable and they're sacred in some ways. And that female friendships in particular, I think are very important because you get something out of it. And yeah, so now I'm going forward. I mean, I by the way, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up. I just turned 46. And now I'm trying to figure out my next job, my next life. But this is my year of saying yes. Shonda Rhimes, who wrote her memoir in 2016, her book is called My Year of Saying Yes. And this is now my year of saying yes. So exploring the world with, open mind and heart.
How wonderful is that? Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And I hope you enjoyed it. I really did, because like I said, it's my story too. I mean, minus the Hillary Clinton part of it. I wish that came true. But questions from the audience, would be very happy to take some questions, please. Please raise your hand and the mic shall come to you. Thank you. Yeah. Right in front, sir. Yeah.
Just thank you for your talk. This is wonderful. And I definitely want to read the book. When do you think the U.S. will be ready to elect a woman president?
Well, that's, if anyone can answer that question, it's $1 million question. Look, I think it's hard. I think it was hard. I think it continues to be hard. I think anyone who is watching what is happening to our vice president in this moment will see how hard it is to be a woman. I mean, the sexism is real and deep and unconscious in our country. Well, and maybe arguably, I don't know, maybe around the world, and the way we elect our presidents, if this was if we elected, I assume you're American, but if we elected people for president based on popularity, well, Al Gore would be president and John Kerry would be president and Hillary Clinton certainly would have been president. So it is a challenge. And in 2016, I write in detail about how hard it was. This idea that, I grew up in the world of politics where if there was, it was the 24-hour cable news channel. So every day you had one proactive message. And if that message was healthcare, every day you talked about healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. And if the tabloids were reporting that Chelsea had an alien sibling, you ignored it because to talk about it elevated the story. We are so far from that in this world of social media where it's the 24-second news cycle. What we learned in 2016 is that not acknowledging it meant it was the truth. So we would travel around the country and people would say, well, she's dying. And that Secret Service agent is her nurse. And we would say, oh, that's nonsense. No one's going to believe that story. And what we found after the election is that plenty of people believe that story. One day during the election, actually, a friend of ours called and said, I went to see my medical doctor for a checkup. And when she went to see her medical doctor, the doctor said, oh, they started chit-chatting and Patty, the friend, said, oh, I'm supporting Hillary. And the doctor said, well, how can you support Hillary Clinton? She's had 11 people murdered. And Patty's like, what are you talking about? She said, well, there's an email of these people she supposedly murdered. And so I think the combination of fake news, of these stories, she really became a caricature. And when you had somebody for 2 years saying, lock her up, totally made up, even if you didn't believe the lies, the back of your head, you're like, oh, wait, maybe she did do something, maybe she did do something wrong. And so that was really hard. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer about this. I don't think it'll be anytime soon. I think that, and I end the book with Kamala, I on purpose, because what I write, and I go back to my son again, is that to me, the way we change this is the next generation is all about, I want my son to not just respect women, but to not fear their power. And that is something that in my opinion, my responsibility, my single most important responsibility as a woman. And until we can get to that place, I do think it'll continue to be very hard for a woman in our country to be elected.
So well said.
Thank you for the question.
Anyone else? Please raise your hand. I can't see.
Oh, we're done.
Oh, there. Yeah. Yes, sir. Take the mic, please.
Thank you, Ms. Abedin, for sharing your thoughts. I am going to read your book right after. Could you talk a little bit about the rise of Kamala Harris, and do you take some credit for it? Though you were not working directly with her, you were working behind the scenes to break other glass ceilings, right?
Thank you. So first of all, I not even remotely do I take credit for Kamala Harris. People forget when she was an elected official from California, she had already broken barriers and made history. She was just and is extraordinary. And she's a great, she's a great example of an immigrant story that just really broke all kinds of glass ceilings. And she has all the right magic, in my opinion. She's smart, she's charismatic, and she made it on her own merits. And a lot of young people now in America, when they say to me, oh, I don't know about getting involved in elected office, I remind them that one of the organizations that Vice President Harris, I'm so familiar with her, I'm calling her by her first name, Vice President Harris, I should be more respectful, worked with to enter politics is an organization that's helping a lot of other young candidates. But I think a lot of women in our country just watched her be sworn in with so much pride, the hope, the optimism, the opportunity. Obviously, this administration, in my opinion, faced gale force winds on day one. The pandemic, inflation, the trying to undo a lot of, in my opinion, some of the damage that had been done, but also trying to reestablish some of the relations in the world. And now this war in Ukraine, it's been a very tough time. She has a very big platform, and she's got a very big responsibility. So I wish her well. I will do anything I can to support Kamala Harris.
Right. I think that's all. Thank you so much. Sorry?
Short. One more?
Yeah, one more question. We have there's a hand there. No women? There are more, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, we'll do him, but let's do a woman.
Yeah, I want a woman. Yeah, can we do that? First a woman, please, and then we can go back to the gentleman right at the back. Two quick ones. Yeah.
Very fast. One answer question. One line answers.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I can't wait to read your book. You mentioned that you always chose to take that call when it came to family and work. Being a new mom, and I haven't yet joined work, and I know I'm going to be really torn between work and my baby. When you go back, when you look back, would you say do things differently if you get the chance, like when you look back?
Probably not.
Yeah.
No.
Very good to know.
I wouldn't do anything. It's the last line in my book. I would go back and I would do it all over again.
That's very assuring. Thank you.
Yeah.
See, one line.
There we go.
Go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you so much for this conversation. I am so intrigued by everything you've spoken about, especially since I've recently studied the context of what you're talking about. I would like to ask, you mentioned popularity in context of like winning an American election. Would you care to elaborate about like some of the details that so when you spoke about that, the thing that came to my mind was gerrymandering, which like you definitely must have heard about. So could you kind of elaborate on other such issues that are faced and that may create obstruction in having a fair win?
So I promised I would answer this very short, and I will happy to talk to you afterwards. there's a difference between electoral college, as you know, and gerrymandering is complicated. The electoral college is just how our system is built. I don't see it changing. It worked for a period of time. In my opinion, it is outdated. It should be looked at again. And if you want to stay afterwards, I'm happy to answer your question more fully because I have a lot of thoughts.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Conclusion. Yeah. Okay, conclusion.
Why don't you? Just
Oh, well, I will go back to what I said at the beginning. It is, I was getting teary when I was backstage. I'm so honored to be in this space. I want to thank Sanjoy, who I saw taking pictures over here, but I want to thank the festival hosts for having me. It has been my dream, to come attend this festival, so to be on stage. And the last thing I will say is a lot of young people ask me for one piece of advice, and I always say to them, do the thing that scares you the most, because it will be worth it. And I have just done the thing that scares me the most, which is I've written my full truth, and it has been an extraordinarily rewarding and gratifying experience. So thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Kunal. Thank you, Sudha. This was amazing. I loved being in conversation with you, especially.
Huma, everything that you mentioned today certainly resonates. On that note, we'd like to thank Huma Abedin and Sudha Sadhanand. Please note that Huma will be signing her books at the book signing desk, which is located just behind the seating arrangement at the front lawn in that cute little yellow tent there. Ladies and gentlemen, please help us in keeping the festival venues clean and dispose of your waste in the waste bins placed across the Hotel Clark's Amir. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at